in my opinion, the emperor never had a stitch on, all right? We have never really known as much as the model of society that we have lived in since, say, the beginning of the 20th century until very recently has pretended to know.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capital Isn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should have killed the capital system in the process.
So for this podcast, Luigi and I wanted to talk to Martin Gurri, whose book, Revolt of the Public, has become something of a cult must-read. The interesting thing about this book is that it was actually first published in 2014. Gurri, in many ways, is not our typical guest. He's not an academic. He's not, heaven forbid, a journalist. He actually was formerly a member of the CIA's Global Media Analysis team. He's now a fellow at the Mercatus Center, and as I mentioned, the book has become something of a cult must-read, particularly in Silicon Valley. It was republished by Stripe Press in 2018, and everyone started talking about it. And Luigi and I both actually wish that we had read the book back in 2014 when it was published. Luigi, is that a fair summary of your views? Do you wish you had read it earlier?
Absolutely. That's an excellent summary. I was impressed because some of the stuff that he wrote in 2014 is stuff that now everybody says, but in 2014, very few people actually had that insight. And I find him incredibly knowledgeable, not only of US politics, but also of Italian politics, which is a very arcane topic. And if you do well in Italian politics, you must be very sophisticated.
Well, for sure. For those of you who haven't read Gurri's book, his basic overarching point is that the current elite has lost its monopoly on information and therefore on legitimacy, that a lot of the great hierarchical institutions that have previously organized modern life depended on those institutions being able to monopolize information. And now that that has broken down, we're in essentially a free-for-all. One of the quotes that Gurri writes, which I like, is, "Uncertainty is an acid corrosive to authority. Once the monopoly on information is lost, so too is our trust."
As a result of this collapse of authority, the kind of protest, the kind of revolt is nihilist revolt. I don't know how you say in English properly. Nihilist is everybody is trying to destroy and attack the authority, but they don't have a real alternative. And this is not just true in the United States, it's everywhere. You go from the indignados in Spain.
Spain's grassroots protest movement began in 2011 and inspired demonstrations elsewhere in Europe and in America.
To the Five-Star Movement in Italy.
Italian voters rejected a referendum to alter that nation's constitution. The vote was seen as the latest instance of a rising tide of populism, both in Europe and here, against elites in the perceived establishment.
To the Occupy Wall Street in the States.
What started as less than a dozen college students camping out in a park near the New York Stock Exchange is now hundreds of protesters, and it's spread to other cities. But what are they protesting?
They're all very good at criticizing what is out there, completely unable to push forward a program of change. Everybody see a problem, and everybody jump on the problem, but nobody comes up with a solution.
Right. And I think it's one of the reasons that there really is no solution. Nobody knows what it is, because there's never been a time in the world like this where no one can have a monopoly on information. And if it's monopolies on information and the control of narrative that gets people to believe, what do you do and where do you go in a world where that doesn't exist anymore? In 2008, the global financial crisis showed that the elites didn't know what they were doing. And that everything everybody said, whether it was the bankers who were supposed to know how to manage risk, or the Treasury Secretary and the head of the Federal Reserve who were supposed to be able to see what was coming in the financial markets, that no one actually understood. And so it helps me understand the financial crisis a little bit better, the devastating impact it had, to think of it as this shattering of trust, in one of the many moments that has shattered trust in the elites, or that showcased what was happening.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, with no further ado, let's bring in Martin Gurri so we can discuss his incredibly provocative and timely thoughts.
So I would like to try to start with that part of the book where he talks about this court decision in Italy, because I think it's a very insightful way to see where Martin is different from basically anybody else. Martin, if you don't mind, explain to the in American listeners what was that decision about and your interpretation of it, because in my view, that's the summary of your unique viewpoint.
In an area of Italy around the city of L'Aquila, was having a lot of seismic activity. And naturally, the people were frightened. And naturally, the Italian government had a body of experts that it could summon for just this occasion. The body of experts, I believe, was called like the Risk Commission or something along those lines, which was a terrible, terrible name as it turned out for them. These were mostly scientists, and the chairman of the group was a bureaucrat. They discussed the possibility of an earthquake. They didn't dismiss it, but there was hovering in the background this gentleman who had this strange idea that certain gases that he understood could predict earthquakes, and he was very popular on the internet. And the whole report ended up them saying there is no risk. There's no risk. This guy who's talking about risk, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I think at one point, one of the reporters said, so you say we should just kind of sit back with a bottle of wine? The member of the board, the chair of the board said, yeah, and he recommended one of the local vintages. So the whole thing was turned into a joke. Well, I think within a day of that, the city of Avila was flattened by an earthquake. It was horrible. Many died and many, many more were homeless. The reaction was the public felt these were the people who should have told us. Essentially, the Risk Commission, which acted as if it knew what was going to happen, delivered a message that was, tragically false. They were taken to court. They were convicted, as often happens in Italy. You get convicted and nothing happens after that. Berlusconi must have been convicted about 5 different times. I don't think he spent a minute in prison. But these good people who were scientists, who were, servants of the government, were subjected to this terrible ordeal of being called essentially murderers by a public that suddenly realized that the expert class wasn't really expert as they were pretending to be. Basically, the issue is, how much does the human race actually know? How much of a grip do we have on the world around us? And it is the job of our elites to pretend that they know far more than they actually do. And my thesis is that that's just the future. I mean, everybody thinks these are crazy Italians acting out their weird political life. No, I mean, after 2008 in this country, there were howls, and they still are to this day, howls that we need to throw people in jail because of what happened to the economy, right? So there's a sense that because the elites pretend to know, this is the high modernist ideal, we know, we have science, and therefore we can explain the world, we can explain the universe, and we have levers that we can pull and change the world around us to your satisfaction, and we can predict the future, we have prophetic insight, and none of these things are true. And when suddenly the fog dissipates and the poor emperor is standing naked in front of the public, there's the urge to tear that poor guy apart.
I love the analogy that you draw to the 2008 financial crisis, and I have to poke a little bit, of course, at Luigi in this, because I think that you wrote that 2008 ended the authority of economists forever. And then as just a subsequent question underneath that, was the emperor always naked, and now we see it, and we didn't before, or did the emperor once have clothes?
In my opinion, the emperor never had a stitch on, all right? We have never really known, as much as the model of society that we have lived in since, say, the beginning of the 20th century until very recently has pretended to know. 2008, the question that kept coming out of their mouth was, how can this happen? How can this happen? How can this happen? All the way down to the Lehman Brothers man who kept thinking, no, the government is going to know something and it's going to do something. How can this happen? The problem was we were dealing with a rhetorical model of discussing the economy as if politicians and experts could maneuver it like a car, could drive it like a car. And the economy is nothing like a car. And a gigantic portion of what goes on is not understood by anyone. And my friend Arnold Kling, who's probably the smartest economist I know, says it is becoming increasingly illegible. There are many, many things since the digital economy hit that are just kind of hard to measure. Our measurements are all industrial, and that era ended 20 years ago. So basically, we're dealing with a world that was way beyond their understanding. It fell apart. They were surprised. The public was angry.
When you think about the figure of the child in the emperor's new clothes, or the person who saw the earthquake coming, or the various people who predicted the financial crisis coming, is that person as accidentally right? Or is there something by virtue of where that person sits that enables them to see a truth that is different? And is there something we can do by giving more credence to that person if the latter is the case?
That speaks to what kind of a conversation do we have about these subjects, right? I think the conversation we have right now is an exchange of anathemas. I ban you from my tribe. No, I ban you from my tribe. And my tribe knows this. No, my tribe knows the other. I've just been rereading for like the umpteenth time Karl Popper, who was a philosopher of science. He basically says science is about the idea that you have to listen to the other fellow, he calls it, because there's that wild possibility that the other fellow might be right. What you are talking about, I suspect, if you were to count people who predicted correctly anything in the future, 99% of it, we're talking somebody who just threw a dart and hit the right place by accident. But the conversation has to be had. There are people who know things who are not accredited in the old expert model, right? I mean, they were everywhere during the pandemic doing a lot of good work. What you're talking about is how do we break down those tribal walls, those sectarian walls between people who believe certain ideals, and then they just hold on to them. Once you believe it, it becomes hardened, but what's just a tribal token, it's like, you can't deny this thing. And so the conversation becomes, well, it's you believe this because you are who you are. I recently, wrote a piece in which I cite this tweet by this young man who has like 1 million followers on Twitter, and says that he believes that wearing a mask is worth the inconvenience because nobody will confuse him with a conservative. And I'm thinking, okay, we're now just gone so far outside of science of this that it's not even worth talking about. What we need to do is break that down to, okay, this conversation is not about conservatives and liberals or about Trump and Biden. It's about what do we know? And then what is that vast realm of ignorance that we always share on every subject on earth?
But I want to come back because I think that this idea that the current elite has lost its monopoly on information, and as a result, they have lost a lot of legitimacy, is very important because I'm not sure what is next. In a sense, it's not going to come back, the legitimacy. Now, we know that there is an attempt to reintroduce some filters on information. For example, Facebook filter out the news that maybe the virus was leaked from a Chinese lab. This was filtered out because it was considered too radical. Where do you see the world going?
Well, that's a good question. I make it a point never to see where we're going because I have no idea. I don't want to be like all these other people who pretend to know more than they know. I can tell you where we are, and that breaks your head enough. I think we're in a very reactionary moment right now. We've gotten rid of Trump, but we've put in Joe Biden. And I think there's this desire to turn the digital platforms into the front page of the New York Times circa 1980. I mean, when you look at that particular incident of Facebook deciding that it was, that theory had been debunked, so we're not going to allow it. We're going to put a ban on it. The conclave of Facebook cardinals decided that this was anathema, And when you look at that, you realize that they had good cover, and the cover was given to them by scientists. Many scientists were saying the same thing. So you have to go beyond Facebook to the total elite class and say, well, why were scientists who were, here's a perfect case of what I was talking about before, right? We are almost completely ignorant about the origins of COVID-19. The things that we don't know about that moment could fill the universe. I mean, you're free to speculate, but yet you have these scientists who said, no, that particular theory has been debunked and you are not allowed to say it. And you have then Facebook saying, well, okay, if it's not allowed, I'm going to ban it. And you have to ask yourself, why did that happen? And it had nothing to do, of course, with science. It had to do with politics.
Did the pandemic play out as you would have expected based on your theory? You wrote this book in 2014. So when you think about how the pandemic played out, whether it was the banning of the idea that the virus emanated in a lab or Gavin Newsom having a recall vote because he was caught at French Laundry having a dinner after he told his constituents not to do any such thing, are these the sort of things you would have expected to see happen, or was there something that surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it followed the previous path of elites pretending to know a lot. Poor Anthony Fauci. I mean, I hate to beat up on him because if you beat up on Fauci, immediately everybody thinks you're a Trumpist or something. Well, but I mean, the guy contradicted himself a lot. You cannot be certain about one thing and then be certain again when you're saying the opposite and not lose a lot of credibility. I was surprised, honestly, by how docile we were in taking it. I think we were all frightened, and so I guess it makes sense, right? But we were told, go home, wash your hands, don't talk unless talked to, and we did that. And I think it dawned on the elites that this pandemic, from the perspective of power, I mean, I'm not imputing that they thought it was a good thing otherwise, but from the perspective of power, was actually playing out to their benefit, where again, the social platforms kind of very docilely decided they were not going to allow independent voices. They were going to basically attach themselves to the institutions and the elites who run them. I was surprised that was accepted. I was surprised that they're still being, I mean, there's this idea they're permanent pandemic. You come up with some other idea, you can put in that slot of, well, we need to control, media because of a pandemic or, anti-racism or social justice. And that slot is endless. You can put anything there you want. And you have a permanent emergency. That means that you can always permanently filter the conversation. So that surprises me. And I'm not sure how it's going to play out.
As you said, the elite have lost the monopoly of information. And so a lot of information is bubbling up. And so they are constantly confronted with pressure and push in every direction. And sometimes even many CEOs are confused on what to do and how much to sort of follow the pressure of the crowd and how much to resist. What is ultimate their business? Because some of them seems to be more interested in being in politics these days than being in business.
Yeah, they don't seem confused to me. They're in stampede mode, and they're all stampeding to, if you want me to say something, if you want me to take out that all-star game from Atlanta because the Georgia legislature is doing things that you don't like, hey, I'm taking that game out. If I'm Coca-Cola and I'm headquartered in Atlanta, and suddenly the stampede it has swept up, it seems to me, a whole lot of these businesses. We were talking earlier about the pressure that made Zuckerberg basically banned the mention of a possibility of the virology lab in Wuhan being the source of COVID-19. That's a part of the stampede, same stampede, okay? So they're not confused. They're just going with the flow. And the flow, that seems to them, is political elites are maintaining all these rules and regulations, what can be said, what can't be said. They have this army of online policemen that if you say the wrong thing, they come and get you and cancel you. That seems to be the model right now. I don't know anybody who's taking a stand against that, particularly, at least not in public.
But Martin, don't you see this as kind of an attempt of the elite to regain control? In the old propaganda model of Ehrman and Chomsky, the idea was that you needed a common religion to basically marginalize any thought that was not mainstream. And so they posit that during that period, anti-communism was the common religion. Now, of course, this religion is long gone. But it seems to me that if you want politically correctness and wokeness is the new religion, and is used to marginalize everybody who is on the fringe, trying to create some trouble. So if you are either from the left or from the right, it doesn't make a big difference. The way you are basically killed is you are seen as a violator of the common religion.
Yeah, I don't think it rises to the level of a religion. To me, if you're anti-racist, then you have to say and behave in very specific ways that the government must mandate. Well, that's control. If you are trying to solve climate change, well, the government must take over all these gigantic parts of the economy. And if you disagree, you're sort of like the equivalent of a Holocaust denier. Well, that's control. You look at the automobile, which to me is like the ultimate symbol of indeterminacy. You can get in a car, go anywhere. the elites hate the car, right? So they try to tax it to death and kind of funnel us into trains and bike lanes, right? Because they can control those. So it's every thought, and of course in social media and in the digital world, there's the politics of official truth, which we had in the pandemic. That's control. So I don't think this is thought out from the top, like a pope coming down with a doctrine that somewhat modifies this great body of logical, mutually supporting constructs. It's just very instinctive, very ad hoc, but it always goes for control.
But you are a believer in representative democracy. As such, representative democracy tends to form some elite. So how the ideal elite should be chosen, should be selected?
Well, I mean, I follow the Spanish philosopher Ortega Gasset in this one. He says it's a mutual selection between elites and the public. We each select our elites by primarily who we give our attention to in this day and age. That is the number one commodity that you donate, but also our money, our votes. What movies do we go to? What books do we read? What persons we follow on Twitter? We make certain personal choices that in the aggregate leads to some of us become the public, and then enough are chosen that they become elites. I see nothing wrong with that system. We could not change our elites if we say so ourselves. So in other words, we have developed the habit of saying the system is terrible, it should be torn down. The elites are terrible, they should be, tarred and feathered. And we have not developed the art of looking in the mirror and saying, so what have I done to change this? How much of this is within my sphere of influence to even a little bit change? We are not self-critical.
How does that way of selecting elites contrast with the American belief in meritocracy and the way in which that's worked over the years? And I feel like it's particularly important today because that belief in meritocracy has been used as a way to justify great wealth inequality and many other things. And I think it's fundamentally different than the system you just described, at least the way it plays out in practice.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that system is fundamentally corrupt right now. Getting a degree from, a business degree from Harvard. Who are you? You're just a guy or a woman who got a degree on business from Harvard. Yeah. But that puts you on a path to make a whole lot of money in Wall Street, right? Because in the end, the elites will not hire anybody who doesn't have that business degree from Harvard. We have forced, or we have stimulated kids, subsidized kids to go to college on the belief that if you go that route, you get to join the great tip of the pyramid. But the pyramid, unless you invert it, is very narrow at the top. So you're creating people who are essentially unhappy because they feel like they've been given all this education, and it could be, in economics, it could be in women's studies, who the heck knows? But the point is, they come out with a degree, they come out with that accreditation, they come out, I'm one of you now, and the people at the top are saying, no, you're not. There's no room up here anymore. And so you go and you do Occupy Wall Street or whatever, because you feel like you've been lied to. You should have been part of the meritocracy. What's the secret key? Well, the secret key is you need an elite up there to say, you're one of mine, come up here, I'll hire you. When you look at the people who have physically led the revolt of the public in almost every country, some exceptions, but almost every country, they have been university educated people. I mean, there's a number of things that play into this, honestly. I think part of it is the idea that you have to go after money, and that is not it's necessary, obviously, but it's not a satisfactory ideal of life. The fact that you want meaning in your life and you try to get it from politics sometimes, and that is a disaster because politics never gives meaning. So there's a number of things that compound into the situation, but the end is anger. You get this great anger because you feel like you've done all the right things and you want all these noble virtues and these magnificent, utopian ideals, and nothing is happening.
You write that the revolt of the public hasn't constituted a real threat to capitalism. Why do you think that is? And is that ultimately a good thing or is that a bad thing?
That's a puzzle. I'll open my soul to you and say, I don't know really. I have a guess, a speculation. And my speculation is that business, unlike government, really does work by trial and error. If you commit error, you go out of business. And some other company comes in. And so there is that constant churning. And as if you see from my book, the turnover of companies in the S&P 500 has accelerated to almost, it's like vertigo levels, right? They used to stay on the S&P. Once they got there, they stayed for decades. And now it's like years or less. And I think what has happened is when somebody delivers the goods, the system is basically justified, becomes legitimate. The old companies have failed, but they have new ones. The failure rate is increasing like it has for everywhere else. The difference is the success rate seems to be maintained because somebody else is always going to make money on that slot. So that's a guess. I mean, there's so many people who hate capitalism so much, so deeply, so profoundly from their souls, that it surprises me that more has not been made of this very, very uncertain and confused and really broken down moment in history.
But one of the things you write is all these protest movements are about everything and nothing. There is not really a alternative ideology.
That's right. They are against. Many times, many times, protesters, I mean, it happened in France with the yellow vests. It happened in Chile, happened in several places. They got what they asked for. The taxes were rolled back or whatever. And they would not take yes for an answer. The spark that starts these protests is never the real reason behind them. There's some existential reason for these protests that is hard to get at because you can't, once you cure the thing that started it, it makes no difference whatsoever. They have no proposals. They have no parties. They have no organization. They have no leaders on purpose. This is actually, they consider to have any of those things to be a lack of virtue. So they cannot supplant the system with some other system, the way the Bolsheviks might have in 1917, because they have no system. They're anti-system.
So if you don't like this model of control and the old model of elite authority is breaking down, again, with the understanding that you are not in the business of predicting the future, what would you like to see happen? If you could write a plan for where we should go without saying that this is where we're going to go, what would you do?
Yeah, I tend to be kind of skittish about saying what I would like, because who the hell cares about what I like, right? We need, I think, I'm a believer in liberal democracy in a really simple way. There are no layers of complexities, no contingencies, in a really simple way. I was born in Cuba, and so I experienced two kinds of dictatorships by the time I was 10. I'm here to tell you that liberal democracy at its worst is better than the most efficient dictatorship, all right? So what I would like to see is the rise of a new political generation that has the guts to say, this is what we know, and this is what I'm going to try. I may be wrong, because you can't be wrong if you're a politician. You're dead after that, right? I may be wrong. Say it up front. I may be wrong. If we are wrong here, we're going to try over here. That's the objective. I'm going to give you the objective very clearly. The means depend on a lot of things that we may not know enough about. Let's try this. Let's try that. Trial and error is the only way the human race has ever gotten anywhere. And our politics have banned it, have banned trial and error. Everybody is in lockstep, right? And even, I mean, slightly different with the states. We still have like a division among states, but even so, there seem to be like two big divides that are walking in lockstep with each other. And I would like courage. Our elites are massively cowardly. And we ourselves as the public are not much better. And I don't mean, like John Wayne in the sense of Iwo Jima or something like that. I mean, the courage to kind of stand up for what is obviously the case, which is we don't know enough. I mean, I think that falls on us to some extent, but hopefully a new generation there are some people out there that are interesting, but not many, I have to admit. I think our elites are just a bunch of chickens that just kind of get terrified by any loud noise and go in the opposite direction.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was really fascinating. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, that was excellent. Thank you, Martin.
Nice talking to you all. I'm going to go have dinner.
One of the interesting aspects that we have seen in the contemporary world is that experts were challenged in their authority. Rather than being open to this challenge, actually closed down like a clam and trying to keep people out and overemphasize their knowledge at the expense of truth. And we've seen that with the pandemic in spades. Remember when we had Mervyn King, he said, the really knowledgeable people are the one who sometimes says, I don't know. I think that is a very powerful message that resonated in my ears when I was listening to Martin Gurri and all these things, because in reality, now experts who are challenged in their status are even less willing to say, I don't know, because the moment they say, I don't know, they say, haha, you see, you're not an expert because you don't know. And so they are overemphasize their knowledge, in the same way in which the seismologists, the Italian seismologists, overemphasize their confidence when there is no confidence. It's that we don't know about earthquakes, and you can be a seismologist, you can be the expert seismologist, and you're not very good at predicting earthquakes. However, you have to have the humility to say, we don't know. And that's the same for the financial crisis. I think that is not that easy to predict financial crisis, probably easier than earthquakes, but a lot of people don't know. However, they behave in their day-to-day operation as if they knew, they had the confidence. So I think we're seeing this phenomenon over and over again. In a conversation, when I challenged him, how do you find the right elite? He was a bit waffly, but in the book, he says clearly that it must come from a sense of respect that comes from the bottom up. And that's the part that is so difficult to reimagine today. How can you gain that respect bottom up?
The parallels between Martin Gurri and Mervyn King, both saying that one of the most important things is being able to say you don't know, is fascinating. It's interesting how these two different thinkers have arrived at the same point of view through very different routes. It's interesting because I am not entirely clear what Gurri is saying, either in the book or the podcast, on this front and on your point that trust needs to come from the bottom up. Because in some ways he says it's not the elites that have changed, that the elites have always been as fallible as they are today, and that the only reason we didn't know that and that people still had trust in the elites was because of their monopoly on information. But in some ways he's saying that something did change, and the way I read his description, at least in our talk with him about what has changed, was that this false concept of a meritocracy has kind of gotten in the way in which people are conferred all sorts of advantages through mechanisms that aren't trust from the bottom up, that are, for example, having gone to the right school, being selected by the right person. And I'm not really sure if that's different than it used to be, and nor am I sure how we go back from that system, given that we have although some of that's starting to be challenged today, but we have had such an overwhelming belief in meritocracy as a real thing.
So I think one big thing has changed, and that is the level of confidence and security that experts used to have and don't have anymore. And let me make an example. I don't know if you know the history of IBM, but IBM was not founded, but was basically made into what it is today, or what it used to be in the 70s and 80s, by a guy called Watson, okay? And his son was actually higher up in the company in the most nepotistic form that you can imagine, okay? However, his son is still revered, and when he passed away, IBM did like a big advertisement in all the newspapers to celebrate his, because his claim to fame is that he went to his father at the right moment and said, we need to move away from typewriters and go into computers, okay? And the father, as all the successful people, tended to be kind of a stubborn, autocratic guy who didn't listen very much. And everybody was afraid to go and tell the old Watson that he was wrong. The son was the only one who could afford to do that. And why am I saying this? Is because if you have your power coming from blood, not from expertise, you are more confident and you can admit you're wrong, or you can bring a different thing, you can change. We're not trying to resurrect aristocracy in any possible form or shape. Let me be very clear. I hate it, but it shows, speaking of meritocracy, it shows one limitation of meritocracy, which is, by the way, amplified by the loss of monopoly on information, because once you had a monopoly of information, you did not have the blood, but you had information that everybody else did not have. Today, you are forced to be challenged in every possible form or shape. The moment all your knowledge is based on you knowing more than others, that's a source of authority, then you become more doctrinaire, because if your thesis is wrong, you are gone as well. And so I think that this challenge of expertise has made the expert more intolerant, more aggressive. I am shocked by my own colleagues and other professors in other fields how aggressive they are on Twitter, saying things that I will never say and I will never think, and having that degree of certitude that I don't have about anything in the world. I personally think that everything can be challenged, but I am a minority these days.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point that sometimes in a way, I think the answer is that it's not black and white. Sometimes in a way, this ability to monopolize information and control the narrative actually turned out to be a positive for the advancement of the world. And sometimes it was a great negative, just like sometimes the confidence of aristocratic elite can actually be a good thing, just as in many cases it can be a bad thing. But I think Gurri's point and your point is similar, which is there's no way we're going back to the way it used to be.
And I want to bring another point, which I don't know to what extent is in Gurri, to what extent is my thinking reading Gurri. At this point is all garbled up. But I don't think it's fully appreciated at large that our modern representative democracy co-evolve with the 20th century media. If you think about it, representative democracy started around the same time in which newspapers started. Universal suffrage came into the picture roughly at the same time as the radio came into the picture. The radio, and then of course TV later, really shape democracy as we know today. It would be surprising that social media and this revolution did not change the way we do democracy today. So the representative democracy, the delegation that we normally do, that you and I grew up with, sounds very primitive to the world of our kids who live on smartphone and can get feedback immediately. So that delegation was invented at a time in which you had to vote in California and send a representative to Washington and probably hear from him, at the time was him, like 2 months later. In a world in which you have instant feedback, do we really want to change nothing in the way we do democracy today?
That's a good question. That maybe representative democracy was dependent on the creation of maybe not a single narrative, because we obviously always had huge disagreements as a country, but dependent on the creation of narratives that resonated. And in this day and age where the narrative has been fractured into a million different bits and pieces, can you still have representative democracy that makes sense? And unfortunately, I would argue that in the era of the pandemic, that we've gone the opposite way of a hopeful sign for that. Because to me, a hopeful sign of the fragmentation would be people's ability to think through it and say, I identify with this and I believe this, but I don't identify with this and I don't believe this. And so for candidates who had a multiplicity to them, and instead, at least what we saw with the gigantic uncertainty wrought by the pandemic is that we all oversimplified. As Gurri used as his example in our podcast, the supposedly smart person on Twitter saying, "I wear a mask so you can see that I'm not Trumpian." I mean, instead we've conflated these things that we should be separating and pulling apart. We've conflated and oversimplified in an effort to use tribalism to ward off the uncertainty of this new world. I worry that just as that didn't serve us well in the pandemic, that may not bode well for our future. If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Not Another Politics Podcast. Not Another Politics Podcast provides a fresh perspective on the biggest political stories. It's not told through opinions and anecdotes, but rather through rigorous scholarship, massive data sets, and a deep knowledge of theory. So if you want to understand the political science behind the political headlines, then listen to Not Another Politics Podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network. One of the places where I wasn't sure about Gurri's diagnosis, I was unclear how this filters through corporate America and why this doesn't. We can see the effects this is having on democracy, but why it doesn't. He's pretty sure that it hasn't interrupted or affected capitalism yet. And per some of our previous episodes, I don't understand if it starts to fray democracy, how it can't fray capitalism as well, except for perhaps maybe the old adage that capitalism is the worst possible system with the possible exception of all others. So maybe capitalism actually fits perfectly in this nihilistic world where we're not sure what to do.
I'm actually with you and not with Martin here. Maybe by being a media analyst is closer to the political world than to the business world. I think that this crisis is enormous in the corporate world. And not only that, that insecurity is multiplied by a factor of n in the business world, because you can be deposed in a second. The one lesson I learned by joining a corporate board and leaving the corporate world for a little bit is how insecure CEOs are. Because you look from outside and say, these guys are super powerful, blah, 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 blah. Why they're not super secure? And the answer is because unless you are Jeff Bezos, that basically you own a majority of their company and so you cannot be kicked out, you can be dismissed at a moment's notice. And this depends on change of the mood, because most board members, I'm an exception, but most board members tend to be kind of fairly yes men-like and say always yes until the moment they say no. So you don't even see it coming. You have total consensus on the board until the next moment when you don't. And that's the reason why businessmen are so paralyzed by the media and the press, because the only thing that can create this common knowledge against their narrative is the media. And so they try to do their best to control the media in every possible form or shape. But of course, the genie is out of the bottle. So the old-fashioned media could be controlled through advertising, through donation, through this, through that. The social media cannot.
I'm going to expand on that and try for something here that may not work, but let me try it. I think that's exactly right. And I think there's another element here, which is that if you go back to the beginning of corporate raiders in the 1980s and 1990s, that was almost, in Gurri-like terms, the destabilizing of the system, in the sense that CEOs could now lose their job for a failure to perform, even if they had the noblesse oblige created by a dependent board and quiescent shareholders. All of a sudden, the system was no longer guaranteed and the upheaval began. And that made CEOs increasingly insecure. I remember Angelo Mazzillo, the former CEO of Countrywide, speaking of the financial crisis, saying afterwards that he had no choice but to get into subprime mortgages, despite the fact that he had never believed in subprime mortgages. He had no choice, because if he hadn't, his board would have fired him. His investors would have said, what are you doing? Why aren't you keeping up with the market? And so that very insecurity led him off the cliff. And I think now with social media, there's another element to that CEO insecurity, which is they can't control the skepticism about their businesses on social media. And you see that playing out in the Elon Musk Tesla debate all over Twitter. Back in the old days, even in the dot-com bubble and in the days of Enron, all you had to control were the major media and the Wall Street analysts. And you could figure out how to control both of them within some reason, because the major press depended on access to you and understood that if they wanted access to you, then they had to behave. And the Wall Street analysts wanted your banking business, and so they understood that in order to get that banking business, they too had to give you authority and say that your stock was a buy. And in this new world, it's a complete free-for-all, because anybody can put anything on Twitter, any piece of analysis that completely undermines what you, the CEO, just said, and they can do so instantly. And so it is a continued destabilization of the corporate world in exactly the same way that we see a destabilization of the political world or of the world at large. Did I get there in a sensible way?
Absolutely. No, you're perfect. Your analogy with the takeover wave is brilliant and suggests, I think, the next step, because my reading of that wave is the insecurity brought to an enormous backlash that led to the incrimination of Michael Milken. Now, I'm not saying that Michael Milken was not guilty, but I'm saying probably was not more guilty than most financiers. And most people don't know that the only thing he went in jail for is parking, which is not parking your car, but parking some stocks during a takeover. Nobody else has ever been punished, as far as I know, for that. Not certainly with jail. So there was a concerted effort to bring down the cause of the instability in corporate America. They succeeded. And afterward, the world was different because the takeover wave of the 80s never repeated itself. And so now the question is, now that the source of instability are the social media, what I suspect is that we are going to go toward a backlash that led to we need to restrict what social media diffuse. And we see with you can't write that the virus was originating in a lab in China because that's false information. They don't know it's false. That nobody has an idea whether it's true or not, but they select that you cannot report that. And next thing you know, you will not be able to report anything negative about the CEOs of large corporations because that infringe their privacy, their royalty, and whatever.
Oh my God, dystopia. That's actually a pretty frightening picture of the world, but I certainly agree with you. It is a slippery slope. I'm going to disagree a little bit about the takeover wave ending. I think it did end, but it got replaced with activist investors who are every bit as destabilizing to CEOs as the takeover magnates of old. So I think the explosion of hedge funds, aggressive hedge funds and buyout firms that know they're not the raiders of old, but they have every bit, if not more, influence on whether a CEO can keep his or her job, have effectively continued to accomplish the same thing. And I'm going to put accomplish in quotes because I'm not sure in the end it is an accomplishment. The more we talk, the more I think about this just key idea of balance, that extremes are dangerous and destabilizing. And I was also thinking as we were talking about this difference between being able to say, I don't know, and insecurity, because many people think that saying I don't know is a form of insecurity, when actually being able to say I don't know is the greatest expression of confidence in yourself that you can possibly have. But somehow we exist in a world where saying I don't know has become equivalent with a form of insecurity. And I was thinking of Gurri's line in our podcast that Karl Popper said, science is about the idea that you have to listen to the other fellow because there's a wild possibility that the other fellow is right. And listening to the other fellow or the other woman takes an enormous amount of confidence. It's not insecurity at all. It's confidence.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review to Capital Isn't wherever you get your podcasts.